Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Joseph Bronski and he's a young scientist. Hello, Joseph. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I am great, Joseph. I have been waiting to interview a guest who is able to comment on mutational load, and I'm happy that you are here with us today. So, Joseph, recently you penned a piece on paternal age and its association with leftism. Joseph, what do we mean by paternal load and why is that important?
Okay, so what I found is that leftism correlates with paternal age, and paternal age means how old your father was when you were born. And the correlation of a trait with paternal age is important because it reflects the extent to which de novo mutations affect a trait. So males in their gametes accumulate about two de novo mutations. This means like brand new mutations in the DNA per year on average after the age of 8 when they start producing some sperm. And so if you have like something like IQ is correlating negatively with paternal age, and that correlation is isolated, it's causal, it's controlled for all confounders, basically, then you know that mutational load is causing IQ to drop by a certain extent. And so the strength of that correlation is proportional to what's called the mutational pressure on the trait, which means how much the trait changes genetically due to mutational load. And that's a part of evolutionary pressure. So overall evolutionary pressure is selection pressure plus mutational pressure plus genetic drift. And evolutionary pressure is the overall change in an average gene score per generation for some trait. So you could have a mutational pressure of zero point 0.3 standard deviations per generation on IQ in the negative direction, a selection pressure of negative zero point 0.1 standard deviations on IQ in the negative direction, and then those would add to produce an overall evolutionary pressure of a zero point 0.4 SD drop in IQ per generation, basically. So that's why the paternal age leftism correlation is so important. And I found that it's about zero point 0.1 when you control for everything. So first off, we made sure that older fathers were as leftist as younger fathers, which is true. There's no correlation between a father's age and how leftist they are, which means that even though people with older fathers are more leftist, it's not because their parents are more leftist. Their parents are just as conservative on average as younger parents. So that's already controlled for. We controlled for birth order to make sure it's not birth order effects, stuff like womb effects. And we controlled for age, since if you don't control for age, any generational trend will correlate with paternal age, since people had younger fathers in previous generations, just for random reasons. So we did control for age, and the correlation held when controlling for age. And we found that the overall correlation was about zero point 0.1, which translates to when you control for this thing called purifying selection, which is a little bit more complicated, but we should expect about a 0.25 increase in leftism due to mutational pressure every generation, given this correlation that I found. Um, in contrast, the selection pressure is actually in the opposite direction. So conservatives produce more children than leftists. And the strength of selection pressure is about 0.07 standard deviations in the conservative direction. So overall, the evolutionary pressure is 0.18 standard deviations in the leftist direction, which is about what we see when when I correlate my leftism metric with age. I find that every 25 years leftism increases by about 0.15 um, standard deviations in the younger direction. So like 20-year-olds are about 0.15 SDs younger than like 45-year-olds. The generation is about 25 years, and we predict from mutational load that it would be going up about 0.18 SD. So basically almost the same number. So it would seem then that mutational pressure explains all of the increase in leftism over time.
Joseph, I love your explanation. It is quite concise, but let's be a bit more practical. By mutational load, what we're basically saying is that the population is becoming more unstable. So people are existing who do not necessarily have the right traits that will enable the population to flourish. In layman's term, this is what we mean by mutational load, mental instability.
Yeah, that's true. So mutational load also causes mainstream acknowledged mental health issues. So my research would indicate that you can actually conceptualize leftism as a mental illness because it's a behavior trait that is increased by mutational load. So it's caused by increasing genetic entropy, decreasing genetic fitness. It actually decreases a person's ability to breed, which is the Kierkegaardian definition of a mental illness. Emil Kierkegaard defines a mental illness as a behavioral trait that depresses your fitness. And so leftism is a behavioral trait that depresses your fitness, and it's caused by mutational load. Other mainstream mental illnesses that are recognized to be mental illnesses by most people that fit this pattern are ADHD, autism, schizophrenia, and depression, and previously homosexuality, which used to be in the DSM, but which no longer is. But all of these have a correlation with paternal age, which means they're increasing due to mutational pressure. Um, the average incidence rate of them in the general population is in fact increasing, and they do in fact, decrease your fitness when you have them. People with these mental illnesses breed less than healthy people. So
Yes,
yes, basically mental illness is accumulating in the population due to genetic entropy. So like the genome is made out of it's about 3 GB of information, um, which is like I'm trying to think how to put that. There's like 3 million base pairs in the genome, and to produce a healthy and optimized organism is a 3 million dimensional optimization problem. And de novo, and so it's like you have the set of 3 million base pairs. And when you change one, your fitness goes up or it goes down. And so if you know anything about like machine learning and gradient descent, evolution, it's kind of just like gradient descent on this 3 million dimensional vector with respect to a fitness function. And so it's going to reach some sort of local optimum when you have a species in genetic equilibrium, but you have this background de novo mutation rate where you're always flipping some bits in this huge vector randomly. And what when you reach an optimal point, what that will do 99% of the time is it will decrease fitness. So it will lead to entropy. It's the principle of entropy. If you study any basic physics, thermodynamics, there are very few ways for things to be nice, but a lot of ways for things to suck. So like a common example of entropy is if you have like a car, there's like one way for your car to be orderly and working well, but there's a lot of ways for it to break. And so just by chance, your car will accumulate damage in random spots that will overall decrease its ability to work. And that's what's happening with mutational load in the genome. And the repairing process is like natural selection, basically. And so the issue is that mutational pressure is dominating our evolutionary pressure equation because there's very little selection pressure. There's very little purifying selection. And this is because people more or less all breed the same amount. So when there's stark differences between how much different people breed and um, and these differences correlate with important traits like leftism, then the selection pressure overtakes mutational pressure and there's no problem. So specifically, if the selection pressure on leftism was more than 0.25 standard deviations in the conservative direction, which it would be if leftism or if conservatism and fertility correlated at something like r equals zero point 0.3, I believe. Instead, it correlates at r equals 0.1. It turns out that the selection pressure is approximately the correlation between fertility and a trait, by the way. So scaled by like a small factor. So you just have to get the correlation between fertility and politics up in the right direction, basically. It doesn't even need to be that strong. It's very tiny right now, and if it was just like 0.3, you would not have increasing leftism. And so the lack of that correlation is basically why mutational load comes to dominate, and you get all this genetic entropy, essentially. The genome is falling apart
Yes.
because life is very easy, basically. Everything's very egalitarian. Life's very easy. Nobody dies off. Um, any sort of a lot of entropy is tolerated, right? It's like a liberal. The liberals breed slightly less, but not that much less. Basically, that's kind of what I'm saying. Is yeah.
Joseph, a civilization is based on the quality of its population. I like the Industrial Revolution. I like innovation and economic growth. But economic growth makes societies prosperous. And when societies become prosperous, they develop luxury beliefs. So when you're in a prosperous society, one can advocate for degrowth because people in the 21st century do not appreciate medieval level living standards. They have no point of reference. So they can say growth is unsustainable. Therefore, we need to revert to a period of degrowth because for most of history, degrowth was the norm, not the exception. Economic growth is quite recent. So these comfortable upper middle class intellectuals and business people, many of them lobby for degrowth. They want a more sustainable economy, not knowing that when societies become richer, they also become more efficient and use fewer resources, therefore they are more sustainable. And I look at the parallel between mutational load and these personalities because mentally unstable people tend to feel emotions more aggressively. They're a bit passionate when it comes to emotions and they spread their views too. It's not genetic, it's cultural. And unfortunate positions are being proliferated culturally in society in the society, like Greta Thunberg. I would describe Greta Thunberg as a social example of what Michael Woodley of Meany calls the social epistasis model, where people spread poisonous ideologies culturally, not necessarily genetically. What do you think about that?
So the rise of leftism is primarily a genetic
Yes,
phenomenon.
yes, I agree. I agree that it's
Um,
primarily genetic, but I'm saying that a civilization is based on the quality of its people. And these
yeah, so
individuals with destructive views that are quite negative, they're promoting ideas both genetically and culturally. So Greta Thunberg, she has a large platform.
yeah, so around and do politics, and that's why our policies decay. So if there wasn't a process of mapping like average phenotype onto government policies, then we would still have the policies of 120 years ago, despite genetic decay. Um, so yeah, I don't know exactly a lot about how phenotype turns into policies, but right now in my research, I just assume that it's something like the median voter theorem holds true, and so it's just going to be a function of like the median of the distribution of leftism, basically.
Yes,
And so it's just like the Greta Thunberg thing is just how that happens. Basically, it's just like the process that creates that, but it's basically inevitable that policies will come to represent the views of the median person, which is shifting left for genetic reasons, right?
exactly my point. So there is a new study out. It's going to be published soon. It's at the preprint stage, and it's basically arguing that the quality of university students has dropped considerably. So we're having more people matriculate into the upper echelons of society in leadership roles were not fit to be leaders. It's the rise of the midwits. And it's genetic and it's cultural. It is cultural because genes affect personalities. And some of these people, they tend to have aggressive personality. They're dynamic, they're charismatic. It's easy for them to sway people. Like in your
I
paper
don't
on
know if they really
paternal
sway
age.
people. I think they just kind of gather. Basically, like, every generation, people shift left because of mutational pressure. And then they like turn 18 and they find that the policies are kind of more right wing than they would like because they come from the past. And so then there's this trivial, like unavoidable process of them gathering each other and saying, like, hey, let's change these policies. And then they inevitably change those policies, and then they're just kind of gone until we shift the gene pool right again, because you can never basically get a majority of people to agree to bring back the policies. Like gay marriage is an example that has happened in my lifetime. We didn't really have gay marriage when I was born, and then by the time I was in like eighth grade, the Supreme Court was commanding all states to allow gay marriage. So that's essentially nobody was really swayed into that. It's just like a bunch of millennial leftists became capable of voting and then just decided like there's going to be gay marriage now. But the lack of gay marriage acceptance came from like 100 years ago. So they just had to change those laws. So it kind of looks as if they're persuading people, but I'd say that's actually a fallacy. It really is all genetic. Like when it comes to leftism, conservatism, I have an idea that different domains have different levels of heritability, basically, or herediticity, whatever you want to call it. Like they're genetically loaded to a different extent. So something like smoking in America, uh, smoking has declined a lot in the last like 50 years. And also in my lifetime, like when I was a kid, there's like indoor smoking everywhere in restaurants and stuff like that. They had smoker sections, but you could always smell it. And then some years ago, like states started banning smoking indoors at all. And that can be a function not of genetics, but of information. I did a small study on this. It's coming. I never published it. Because it's quite a trivial study, but I basically asked people how open they were to changing their views based on new information on different topics. And when it came to leftism, like feminism, homosexuality, anti-racism, that kind of stuff, they were not open at all, which lines up with the fact that leftism is 70% heritable and that mutational pressure seems to account for all of the change in leftism over time. But when it came to something like banning tobacco or coffee, it basically, they said they were very open to persuasion and that it came down to information and it came down to the science as to whether that stuff was healthy or unhealthy. And so when you look at the policy change on tobacco, that's a domain where it is like a cultural model. You have people persuading each other that maybe cigarettes are unhealthy. Look, the science says that it causes cancer. People didn't know this before, and then they're successful, and then there's anti-tobacco policies now because of that. But with leftism, like gay marriage, there's no information that proves gay marriage is good. It's just 100% genetics. People just decided because of mutational load, millennials just turned 18 and 20 one day and decided that they want gay marriage now, that they don't have a problem with it. And so they just kind of forced that on everyone else. And so there wasn't really persuasion. People aren't really open to changing their minds on leftism specifically. It's a domain. Everyone, all these writers always try to model leftism like it's tobacco, like it's a heavily cultural domain where there's lots of persuasion going on. But it's not true. There's no evidence for that. All the evidence seems to point against that. It's a very genetically determined domain like IQ and height. Like you can't persuade people to be smarter, for instance. Like IQ affects policy, and if you drop IQ, some policies are G loaded. And when they're G loaded, that goes into making them overall a function of genetics. But some policies are also leftism loaded, where leftism is a function of genetics. And if you drop general intelligence and you get dumber policies, it's not because of persuasion, it's just because the people lost IQ. And IQ is obviously just all genetic. You can't persuade someone to be smarter. And it's like that with leftism. You can't persuade someone to be more conservative. It's basically a moral temperament thing and not a function of being convinced of stuff.
I agree. I am agreeing with you 100%. I'm not deviating from the argument at all. I think what you're saying is logical and it is indeed genetic, but I am a student of history and economics, so I tend to focus on culture and I like to follow patterns and trends of history. So I keep repeating the point that a civilization is based on the quality of its people. And even though what you're saying is genetic, even though what you're saying is true, that these patterns are genetic, they will influence culture. They are influencing culture, and the culture is becoming more degenerate. So there is this economic historian called Joel Mokyr. I'm a big fan of Joel. And Joel contends that the Western world, Northwestern world became more progressive. Intellectuals, entrepreneurs, and efficient workers, the people he refers to you referred to these individuals as possessing upper tail human capital. So the trio, these individuals, they became more progressive in the sense that they started to apply theoretical knowledge to solve problems. Recently, some younger economists decided to test Joel's idea and they confirmed it by using Google data. Then, after that study was published, a writer, somebody who writes for the Financial Times, he penned an article saying that yes, the findings of the study are indeed accurate, but further analysis has shown that we're becoming less progressive and the use of certain words are in decline. So Western civilization is becoming less supportive of risk, it's less optimistic and overall more pessimistic. And that's not the right policy for future growth and progress. So I like the bourgeois lifestyle. I like that Western civilization is comfortable. I like that I'm in my room speaking to you on Zoom on my computer. I like that we don't need to leave our home to buy food. We can just take out the app, order the food, and it comes home. I like the bourgeois lifestyle, but I'm also a conscientious person. I think about the future and I like to work. So comfort has a disparate impact on people. Some people, because of comfort, they become lazy. Other people might continue to be progressive. So I find your research interesting because the findings portend doom for society, and I'm wondering how do we reverse these effects?
I think I have an upcoming article in Aporia, and I discuss this there. So I'm often hit with the objection to this research that it's all very blackpilling. So I haven't really gotten any sort of high quality rebuttal to my data or my reasoning. Rather, I've just had a couple of people say that it's blackpilling and then launch a few like gish gallopy cherry picking attempted rebuttals of my research. There was a guy named Arctotherium that did something like this, and he wrote like three articles and made maybe two decent points, and those points were unsubstantiated, but
Where
gave
where
me
did,
like
where
a
did you write these articles?
he just wrote them on a Substack basically.
Yeah.
But it was like three articles and only two good points. And those points were you should expect a similar paternal age correlation with IQ as with leftism. He did not substantiate this point, meaning he did not he tried to claim that there was no correlation of paternal age with IQ. Um, he didn't properly substantiate that with evidence. I have conflicting evidence that says that IQ has a paternal age correlation of the same magnitude as leftism in the negative IQ direction. So that would basically debunk that point. And then the second point was something about predicting national leftism from like overall national mutational load, like by looking at differences in infant mortality. He didn't really substantiate this point. He tried to say something about Quebec, but his data was way too noisy. Um, And Quebec had like a lot of immigration and gene flow that would just offset any sort of mutational pressure that would cause a lot of leftism. Because he tried to say that Quebec had really low infant mortality for some reason very early, and this would predict more leftism. But he basically ignored the fact that Quebec started out very conservative and religious compared to other countries, which would basically put them further to the right. And so even if they advance in leftism faster, you would maybe only expect them to be moderate right now, just like Americans, instead of particularly conservative, which is approximately what you see, which is sort of confirmatory for the theory, but it's like the data here is far too noisy to make anything of it. And then everything else he said was just sort of like, it didn't even make sense. Like a lot of it was just very like noisy scatter plots.
Exactly.
And so, my point is that I caught this guy somewhere saying that his main objection actually was that I'm blackpilling and that he wants to fight leftism properly. And so he just thinks that my research implies that we can't fight leftism. So he just felt the need to cherry pick evidence to try to rebut it. And that's
No,
really where that came from. He didn't
what's the
actually have like
point?
a solid.
No, what's
And
the point? So for look,
so,
you listed two rebuttals about paternal age and IQ. This is a really simplistic example. Well, maybe the finding of this study was not replicated, but there was a study published some years ago saying that if your dad is an older person, you're more likely to be a smarter boy.
yeah, when you control for father's genetics and birth order, what you get is an R equals negative 0.1 correlation. That's from a study in the last year done out of China, but it was from an HBD guy. I forget what his name was, but some HBD guys that I vaguely know did it,
Oh,
and it
Menghu?
was published.
Was it
Yeah, I think it
Menghu?
might have been Meng Hu, maybe under a pseudonym. It was like a different name, but it seemed like it might have been him. I'm not sure on that. I don't want to dox him, but I need to pull up the paper actually. Actually, just let me find that paper. I'll drop the title of it since I guess this is important. But anyway, my point in that example is you asked me, what are we going to do about it? Is this blackpilling? And so I wanted to make the point that in my article coming up in Aporia, um, I talk about how it's really no harder to fight mutational load than it is to fight culture. Conservatives that are convinced that it's cultural and that their next blog post is going to save the West have been failing for 100 years to do this. So it seems pretty hard. We now have Richard Hanania saying that we just need to delete civil rights law, actually. So Richard Hanania is kind of catching up and realizing, hey, blog posts aren't going to save the West. We need to make some sort of legal impact. Okay. And it's like, yeah, we do need to make some sort of legal impact. So I would argue that fighting mutational load is no harder than Richard Hanania's idea of overturning civil rights law. So instead of well, I support overturning civil rights
I
law. I
do
think that's
too.
good, actually. I don't think that in the long run that will actually get rid of leftism. It'll just come back like a cancer, basically. It's like when you get rid of cancer and then it just comes back after a year. That's what will happen if you just delete civil rights law and you don't do anything else. It'll still exist in the background. It'll come back, or there won't be any substantive change. That said, I do support deleting it technically, just like if we had cancer, I'd support cancer treatments, right? But it's like we have to get to the root of it, and the root is genetics. And so what we have to do is we have to pass anti-mutational load policies. And these policies are really simple. Like I said, you need to, for one, you can reduce mutational pressure by encouraging younger breeding. So older fathers and older mothers have more accumulated mutations. If people are breeding in their teens and maybe getting done breeding in their early 20s, then there's less mutational pressure just because of that. There's still some mutational pressure, but it becomes easier with less selection pressure to overtake the mutational pressure when mutational pressure is lower because people are having kids at younger ages instead of older ages. We're having kids at some of the oldest ages ever. And that doesn't help. It's maybe not the main cause of mutational pressure. The main cause is pretty much the lack of selection pressures. So we need policies that increase selection pressures too. But it would be very easy and painless to just, I'd say everyone would win to encourage teenage breeding, basically, like the ancient Roman marriage pattern. right? By the time you're 30, do you even want to? I'm hardly even attracted to 30-year-old women. It's
No,
like
but I've said that before.
men
When a
want a
woman is
teenage
30, nobody's looking.
men want, it's like the average age of breeding is 30 now. I don't want to have sex with 30-year-old women. I'm not attracted to them. Also, by the time a man is 30, your sex drive is lower. Teenage males want to have sex and produce kids. Teenage girls are attractive. So we need people to be like 18 and married, like in ancient Rome, like in the 50s, whatever. And they need to be having their last kid before the age of 25. That will immediately like cut the mutational pressure in half just because of the children being less mutated. Then the other thing is we need to do eugenics. And so basically, I think that we can do it in a very nice and easy way. We redistribute money to genetically fit people, high IQ people. And in the case of politics, you have to redistribute money to smart conservative couples. And so we basically just pay them to have more kids than other couples to the extent that the correlation between conservatism and fertility becomes greater than 0.3. That's all you need. So you're not stopping other people from having kids. You're just increasing the amount of kids that the people that you want are having. And that's all you got to do by law, basically. And then if you successfully do that, the selection pressure increases to overtake the mutational pressure. And congratulations, conservative genetics are once again accumulating in the gene pool, and the country will get more right wing over time. It's that easy. If we can get rid of civil rights law, then we can do that. People are talking about having a red Caesar. Mutational pressure is definitely fightable if you basically implement a Caesar, right? It's like if the Caesar has any power at all, he can do this. You know what I'm
I,
saying?
yes,
So
I do agree with you. But
it's that
my
simple.
I have a policy that's quite simple. And it's not even controversial. It's uncontroversial because voting is not a human right. Voting is a privilege. It is not a right. It is a consequence of state formation. Voting influences culture, politics, and the economy. If you are under 25, unemployed, and on welfare, you shouldn't vote. I seriously believe we need to, I seriously believe that we need to limit the franchise. You should be 25, educated, and working.
I agree with that. That's why I brought up the red Caesar. So conservatives who don't know about mutational load are already talking about limiting democracy. So if it's difficult to get the average prole to vote for eugenic policies, then start limiting the vote. That's where you start. Start getting rid of their ability to vote until you have a voting pool that will implement the eugenic policies. So yeah, I do agree with that. And so you can start by, I guess you can have some sort of age restriction. I have a book called The Empirical Introduction to Youth, where I sort of counter ageism. Um, However, in the short run, because I don't necessarily believe actually that like a smart 18-year-old is an inferior voter to a dumb 25-year-old.
Neither do
So
I. Neither do
I don't
I.
think age is like the golden pot, but in
The,
the short
no,
run,
I
increasing the
chose
age limit on voting is good since younger
I chose
people are more
25.
mutated,
I chose
right?
25 because science shows that the brain is more developed at 25. That's why I chose 25. It
Well,
wasn't
I debunked that in my book. The brain is finished developing around 15 or 16. But that aside, the key is actually you want to have an IQ limit on voting. You want to bring back like knowledge tests at the polls. You don't want to let really low IQ people vote to begin with.
yes.
That and then also some sort of like usefulness, wealth metric. So back in the 18th, early 19th century, we only let like landowners that paid a certain amount of money in taxes vote. Bring that back. Don't just let parasites vote. That's most of
I
the left.
agree.
If
I
you cut
agree.
out really low IQ people and you cut out people that are taking more money from the government than they're giving, then you'll have a much more conservative voting population just
I
from that
agree. I
right
agree
there.
100%. And contrary to what some people assume, not voting does not put you in a disadvantaged position. When there's this writer, Ernest Bax, he wrote a book, The Fraud of Feminism. And he basically noted that even when women did not have access to the same rights and privileges as men, they did relatively well. Politicians will govern in the interest of women and children, even when they are unable to vote. So not being able to vote will not set back anybody.
Yeah, I agree with that. If you read any Western Anglo history, um, not being able to vote doesn't mean anything. You don't end up in like a concentration camp. You're just a normal person. Most Americans don't even exercise their right to vote. So just formally getting rid of it won't really change things. Anglos will still be fundamentally civilized people. You know, I want to do these eugenic policies, but it would be like positive eugenics. So we'd just be reversing the welfare trend. So yeah, it would not be, it's like it would be a better place to live basically. Nobody would really be harmed. It'd just be like, you know, you don't let little kids vote. Little kids aren't uh terrorized all day because they can't vote. So it's like, why would you let 80 IQ
Politicians
adults vote?
are the biggest lobbyists for children and women, and children don't vote, but children are a protected class in every society, or at least every civilized society. Children are a protected class. So there are some societies today where twins are killed, but for the most part, children are a protected class in civilized societies. Do children vote? No, children do not vote. Politicians argue that there is a right to education. They believe in investing in human capital. Do children vote? Are children lobbying for grants to go to school? No. But yet children have done well under most regimes, but they don't vote. When women were not able to vote in England, the law was still patriarchal. It protected women. Not voting is not a disadvantage.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't really think women should.
And that's okay. That's not a contentious position either. Women are less supportive of free speech policies and they are economically status. So if women did not vote, the side of government would be reduced and we would also end up with more pro-market policies. Politics would be less contentious if women did not vote. Identity politics is being propelled by women. We talk about identity politics and feminism and radical environmentalism because of women. Whenever you look at a protest, what do you see? I didn't say welfare, said what, because I want to describe the imagery. You see women and men who look mentally unstable, women and effeminate men. That's what you see. These are the people driving identity politics and cancel culture. Yes.
Yeah, that is very true. Yeah, women, the other thing about voters is you can basically take away the right to vote of anyone who cannot defend themselves in a war. So voting is war by proxy. So the idea of women voting was always weird because they're not going to pick up guns and go to war against men. So they should basically be represented by their husbands. The idea of independent women is sort of a farce. It's a paper tiger,
It's a
basically. It can
misnomer.
very easily. So,
Women,
like if you suspend the 19th Amendment, there's not going to be like a woman's army that
no.
overthrows the government. So it's like, just why did we let them vote? And they vote stupidly. They
Look,
don't vote.
I'm going to end this conversation and send another link so we can do a part two and we'll talk more about women. So I'm going to close this link.
I do have to go. I only had 1 hour, so maybe some other time.
Oh, all right. But thanks for having you.
But yeah,
Bye.
thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me on. Bye.